Well, I wanted to say hello and welcome to everybody dialing in today. We have a great panel, and I will introduce the speakers first. But first, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Aaron Stein. I am the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I am emceeing this event. Normally, our president, Raleigh Flynn, would be leading in these introductory remarks, but for good news for Raleigh is that she had her second dose of vaccine, and so is currently unavailable as she is basically getting prepared to enter back into real life. I wanted to welcome everybody because the backdrop to this event is that shortly after taking office, President Biden and the new American administration, along with the Russian Federation, renewed the New START Treaty for 5 years. And I have to give credit to Joshua Siegel, who was on this call, who is a former FPRI high school intern and has a long distinguished career in arms control as well as on active duty, proposed this panel and was able to help bring it together. I'm going to just briefly introduce our guests. Who will give about 35 to 40 minutes of prepared remarks, of which I will be moderating a discussion, less prepared, more off the cuff. And for those of you who are attending, this should be relatively straightforward. But for those who this is your first time on Zoom, at the end, I will be taking moderated questions and answers. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button that you are able to click, and you can type in your questions and I will be able to field them and moderate them. If that doesn't work for you for any reason, you can also use the chat function, but I would prefer that you use the question and answers. So with that, I'm going to quickly do introductions so that we can get to the presentations themselves. Just going down the list on my screen, we have Rose Gottemoeller, who is the Frank E. and Arthur W. Payne Distinguished Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. And I think for the purpose of this call, while she was Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control Verification and Compliance in 2009 and 2010, she was the Chief U.S. Negotiator for the New START Treaty with the Russian Federation. And a caveat to that, I actually played Rose in a simulation while I was a grad student at the now Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. We have Ronald Layman, was the director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency from 1989 to 1993, when START 1, START 2, the Chemical Weapons Convention, Conventional Forces in Europe, and Open Skies, as well as other historic agreements were concluded. We have Curt Seaman, who served in the U.S. Army Infantry, Foreign Area Specialist and intelligence positions from 1962 to 1994. He served on the START 1 and START 2 negotiating delegations. He was the Senior Department of Energy representative to the negotiation of the New START Treaty and special counselor to the lead negotiator, which is Rose Gottemoeller. He is responsible for a number of other negotiations in his career. I would encourage you to look at everybody's bio themselves because I am synthesizing them. And then finally, we have the aforementioned Dr. Joshua Siegel, who has been involved in most of the bilateral and multilateral chemical, biological, and nuclear arms control negotiations, as well as interagency policy forum. He's an expert on verification who went on active duty after 9/11 and is just recently retired. And as I said, most importantly, began his career as a high school intern at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. So I welcome all of you. And with that, Rose, I wanted to begin with you and just ask sort of a basic question, which is, if you look back, at the negotiation of the New START Treaty, how would you say that it came about? What do you think its strengths are? And what were your thoughts when you saw that it was extended for 5 years?
The New START Treaty is on a long continuum of strategic arms reduction treaties. Well, actually starting with some strategic arms limitation treaties back in the 1970s, but we started after, particularly after START entered into force in 1994, to actually reduce and eliminate, not just limit, nuclear forces. And so for that reason, we call these treaties strategic arms reduction treaties. And so START was going out of force in 2009. It limited the strategic nuclear arsenals of the Russian Federation. Well, it was negotiated when the USSR was still around, but after the Soviet Union broke apart, it remained in force, served as an important instrument for getting nuclear weapons out of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, and also reduced and eliminated many weapons on the US and Russian side. But it was going out of force in 2009 when President Obama was coming into office. So he was resolved, and his Russian counterpart, then President of the Russian Federation, Medvedev, were resolved to replace it as soon as possible to try to ensure that it was replaced by December of 2009. When START was going out of force. So that's how it came about. It was a rapid fire negotiation because we didn't have very much time. Now, we didn't end up making the December 2009 deadline, but we did get the treaty done in April of 2010. And after a 6-month ratification process, that was a difficult negotiation with the Senate, it came into force then in February of 2011. So that's the timeline. What the treaty does is continue to reduce and eliminate force structures, so missiles like intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine launched ballistic missiles are limited to 700 under the treaty. It limits the launch vehicles that they are carried on as well to 800 deployed and non-deployed launch vehicles, and it limits the number of warheads that can be deployed on strategic nuclear weapon systems to 1,550. Still sounds like a lot maybe to your listeners, and it is a lot. That's why I say that we can continue to reduce and eliminate and must continue to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. But to be honest with you, it's a big change from when START entered into force in 1994, when we each, Russia and the United States, had approximately 12,000 deployed nuclear warheads on our strategic nuclear delivery vehicles. So from 12,000 to 1,550 isn't bad, I think.
No, certainly not. And, Kurt, I know that you were also involved. I know absolutely vital to the process. If maybe you could take us a little bit behind the curtain to both the US and Russian maybe opening positions and how differences were overcome throughout the negotiations, and maybe what each side valued as they looked to mutually reduce, but obviously serve their own national interests in doing so.
In the very beginning, when I first went to Geneva in 1985, our positions were still not formulated. And we actually, at that point, did not have a treaty text or a draft treaty text to work with. We used once a week plenary meetings that ran to lay out our positions, and generally the plenary meeting would last almost 2 hours by the time the plenary statements were read and there was a discussion. And then we then broke for work groups at the end that met for about an hour. And the joke at the time was that we used to call that the Battle of the Bladders, because nobody got to go out of the room for the entire period that you were there. But eventually the United States did it first. We developed the treaty text, and then the Russians followed with the treaty text. And what we worked to do then was to put together what we called a merged treaty text. We took the US position and the Russian position on similar issues and merged them into the US text, and then used a series of footnotes. We were one, they were two, to identify the differing positions. And those positions where we could not agree was in brackets in the text, and the common language that we could agree, which was mostly nothing substantive in the very beginning. And then what we did was establish working groups, and we worked on the text, and we discussed the text. We discussed it paragraph by paragraph, found out how we could agree. I sometimes think that negotiating is kind of a funny thing. You have to pay more attention to the ideas and the concepts than you do to the specific words that you've been given to negotiate. So in the end, the process is very much like capturing your ideas in somebody else's words. And as we move forward to do START 2, And when we did New START, we went through a similar process where each side put together a treaty. And then the initial thing was to merge it together and then to try and work in individual groups to try and achieve a common text for everything. At the end, there's always issues that you can't resolve. And for me, it's one of the most interesting parts of negotiating a treaty, because you try and evaluate the issues that you couldn't win on and the issues that the Russians couldn't win on in each one of the parts of the treaty. And then you propose trades. You pick 5 of their issues that you think are of the same value as 5 of your issues. And then Rose or Ron was not the ambassador at the end, but Linton Brooks at the end. You do a little bit of trading to try and get what you want. And in the end, you get most of what you wanted, but there are always a few things you didn't get. And there's some things that are unexpected after the treaty enters into force.
I mean, Ron, do you just have anything to add to that rather than me prompt you with the question? I feel like you 3 all know each other far better than I do. But I was going to ask you a little bit about the verification processes. But if you have anything to add to what we've just heard, please go for it. You're on mute, Ron. Just Ron.
You brought 4 very good friends together with a lot of common history. Let me say, you were asking about, the role of the negotiators, and to some degree, you can't disconnect what we do in arms control from the full range of other activities in defense, deterrence, diplomacy, democracy. They all interact, and there's an issue of everything's connected to everything, but some are more connected to others. And a lot of the negotiating is figuring out where you start to draw the line and you differentiate. And I think one of my favorite heuristic questions is what's more important, what's changed or what remains the same? And I think in the world we have today, as in each of the phases in the past, we have important geopolitical and technical changes that give us something of a ever steeper learning curve. But at the same time, we have to recognize there's a bit of a forgetting curve. We sometimes forget that things did change over time, that we actually invented new tools to address some of the old issues. So each of the treaties took place, the strategic offensive arms treaties, took place in a different political environment and a different technical environment. I came to Washington when the SALT I treaty was in effect and had been vigorously debated by the Senate, and SALT II was emerging. The 2 sort of attempts to provide a linchpin for détente. I was heavily involved in START I, which, like INF, was one of the treaties at the culmination of the Cold War. I tend to think of START II as the first of the post-Cold War treaties, and we solved some old problems in different ways in SALT II. The SORT Treaty or Moscow Treaty was yet another manifestation of sort of the spirit of the post-Cold War. My thinking on New START has changed a little bit. At one time, I would have said it was the 3rd of the post-Cold War treaties. But to some degree today, I like to think of it as sort of the reset treaty, because by the time Rose and others were negotiating New START, developments in Russia had become sufficiently clear that we were trying to restart, but we knew we had some problems. We had already seen this in particularly in the European context and the European arms control context with CFE, CSBMs, CSBMs, Europe confidence building measures, and other things, Chechnya. So New START was kind of an attempt to be careful, but try to get things going. Now, I'll say something, I'd be interested in how others react to it, but in a sense, if we're really sort of in some kind of post-Cold War world right now, then we now have a treaty for the post-Cold War world. And that's the New START extension, because it may well be about the all you could do in this environment to kind of stay engaged and keep things going. But the challenge that we're going to face is in the future is we are experiencing rather tumultuous geopolitical change and new technologies. Now, you mentioned verification. I won't go on at length, but to say that verification is one of those issues that is not widely understood, but we spend a lot of time on it. We talk about it a lot. We put a lot of money into monitoring, but it's actually a much more complex process, and it is often a challenge in dealing with closed societies, as we're going to be doing again. And it's also a challenge in dealing with things like ratification in the Senate. It can be done. The Threshold Test Ban Treaty languished for years in the Senate, but through the joint verification experiment and the negotiation of some verification protocols, we went back, and a treaty that neither hawks nor doves particularly liked went through the Senate 98-0. So sometimes if you get your act together and you have people like Kurt and Josh making sure that you get it right, you can address some of these verification challenges. Problem is, what people are demanding more and more is verification of warheads. And let me tell you something, that's tough. We have ideas, but we got a lot of work to do. So does that help you, Aaron?
I mean, it does. Maybe before I head over to Josh, I'm going to come back to Rose. It may actually be worth you spending a sentence or two about, because Rose gave numbers, but perhaps how you account for those numbers in your verification, i.e. we're not counting warheads, but what we're attributing numbers to certain vehicles. Do you want to take that, Ron, or?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking Rose.
Oh no, I'll come back to Rose. I'm going to ask Josh one thing. It might be worth to give one or two sentences on that, just to give a sentence of, because I think that's an important point to tease out.
When a group of us, including Linton Brooks and others, used to sit around and talk about what we were doing, we used to laugh at everybody's use of numbers. The problem is what drives the numbers is the definition. And but let me say that the tendency is to think that we're talking about actual warheads. Well, the idea of a warhead is pretty clearly understood. Coming up with a definition of what would be an accountable warhead, if you were actually dealing with inventories of actual warheads and their components, that's much tougher. And what is the inspectable item? These issues are going to be tough. So it won't surprise you that in SALT 1, we didn't deal with warheads. We dealt with delivery systems and bases and platforms. So for example, it limited numbers of submarines. It counted holes in the ground and tubes on submarines. In the ABM treaty component of it, it counted bases. Why? Well, because that's what you could count. SALT 2 tried to deal with warheads indirectly by trying to cap the number of warheads you could put on multiple warheaded missiles. By the way, SALT 1 didn't deal with bombers at all, and SALT 2 dealt with them with very loose rules. And I have to commend Rose, because in START 1, we wanted to discount bomber weapons for a number of reasons having to do with stability and defenses and their conventional roles, and the problem of verification. And so I proposed a bomber discount rule, and the Soviets agreed to a compromise that wasn't as good as what I had proposed. Well, what I wanted was what Rose got in New START. And that's a very valuable tool for providing for the stability that comes from the diversity, such as the triad, and for the very important role that aircraft and bomber weapons play. But now what does that mean? Well, what it means is, let's take bomber weapons. How would they have counted? Let's say you take the current force structure of 60 bombers, and how would they have counted in terms of countable warheads under the various treaties? And the answer is that in SALT 1, they wouldn't have counted at all because they weren't in there. In SALT 2, it would have been no practical limit, but bombers were counted as one. In START, they would have been discounted to some number, and I think it would have been 420. Under START 2, though, they would have been as equipped, and they would have counted as 1,124. But in New START, they count as 60. Okay, so what am I saying? Well, what I'm saying is we use different tools to solve the issue of how to maintain a balanced triad under different treaties, and they all worked fairly well. But part of the problem was you used accountability to, well, it's confusing about your question about the numbers because you're talking apples and oranges. In the end, it was designed to avoid the problem of how do you actually go after stockpiles and inventories of weapons and their actual components. But someday we're going to have to step up to that, and that's going to be a challenge. But it's also going to result in sticker shock on numbers, because people like to talk about 700, 800, or 900 in START 1, or 1,600 in START 1. But in fact, the number of warheads has always been higher.
Right. And so I'm going to come to Josh now to talk about, to talk about some of the forthcoming complexities, where, looking at new things of strategic stability and, maybe changes in the strategic environment, some of which were, I think, touched at by the outgoing Trump administration, which is the role of potential other actors, moving this beyond a bilateral sphere between U.S. and Russians. And then Rose, I'll come back to you and Kurt about challenges moving forward, negotiating updated New START in the current era. So Josh, floor is yours.
Yeah, appreciate it. So one thing I noticed over in the window of some of the questions popping up, there's I want to address something over there that actually ties to what we're talking about here. And I think the comment was a treaty is only as good as the verification measures and how good its verification is. So I kind of want to take a step back, because that immediately goes into, if you're going to look at bringing in countries like China, a treaty, we have to, a arms control treaty is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. It's part of a broader, as Ron said, geopolitical strategy. And I like to tell students sometimes that a arms control treaty can act as almost like an Instapot. You have to cook up in pressure, and the pressure gets something to where it's ready, but then you let the pressure off and you have a product, and you have to kind of figure out what to do. So the first thing it is a chance to communicate. It's a vehicle for communication. It's a vehicle that opens up an ability where two countries might be at loggerheads, but then begin a dialogue, begin a discussion, build relationships, open avenues for communication. And that's at its most fundamental level what it is, because if we go back to the original treaties with the Russians, New START is the result of 40 to 50 years worth of relationship building, trust building, communications, collaboration, development of tools, and experiential learning between the two sides. When I had started in the community back in 90, if you had told me we would have even begun discussing getting within 5 feet, 10 feet of a warhead or a delivery vehicle, I would have said you're crazy. It wouldn't have been possible. So the fact that we are where we are is fairly tremendous. The other thing is, up until the INF treaty, we were talking about adequate verification. Then we start talking about effective verification, which is where we are now. And you can't apply the term effective verification to a treaty that, so for example, if we were to do anything with China, China has always worked very hard to keep us at length away from its most sensitive assets, which are, in fact, it's warheads, it's missiles, it's a much smaller arsenal than the US. And we have to go back and say, well, what are we trying to achieve if we were to bring in a country like China? What did they have to gain? Because as we talked about, both sides, nobody comes into a treaty not wanting to gain something. Both sides are looking for something. So what are we trying to accomplish by bringing in China? What does China hope to gain by coming in? And so when you're talking about that, the first thing with China is we have to remember we're right now already at we have something where we can begin to discuss something with them, which is a CTBT. We negotiated a treaty, we signed a treaty with China. We have not yet ratified, they have not yet ratified. So there's an area right there for beginning some discussion on, and there's some issues there that have come out in public, a forum for discussion, a forum for letting off some pressure, a forum for beginning some legitimate strategic dialogue in the nuclear sphere. In strategic nuclear weapons, as China keeps bringing up, they have an arsenal that by some estimates is 1/10 the size of the US or Russia. They don't want us knowing where their missiles are. In fact, during the Chemical Weapons Convention, what was widely known but not said was the facilities that the Chinese were afraid that we would conduct abusive inspections against were those very facilities where their weapons and missiles were stored. So in order to kind of discuss anything on the level of, say, New START, one needs to be able to reveal those things, which the Chinese have never indicated any willingness to do. The other piece is, which I'm going to step back into a cultural issue, is as Kurt and I've talked about many times, and Ron and Rose, is those personal relationships, that understanding of how you have these discussions. We have never had a bilateral strategic nuclear discussion with the Chinese. Culturally, our two nations, whenever we've had diplomacy, it's been somewhat challenged. We as the US tend to speak first. The Chinese usually wait to speak last, because if somebody else represents their issues, they will let the other country take the lead. In CWC and BWC, they always let the US and other countries take the more standoffish approaches on the intrusiveness of verification, and then would either be quiet or mention something in support or just off on the side, because they don't want to be perceived as the stick in the mud. So where I'm going with this is looking at China or adding other countries like China into a strategic framework, we have to reframe the entire paradigm. The Russians are, and are, to have it, look at it in the context of a New START would be watering down New START to such a level that would almost entirely undermine the entire purpose and objective of that treaty if we were to have something where all three sides were equal. But where we go down to that whole thing about verification, sometimes your objectives in a arms control treaty might just be transparency. And again, you maintain a level of vigilance according to the level of confidence you have. So effective verification increases confidence, you let your guard down a little more. But if you're just being transparent, that's why they call them confidence building measures. Because when your confidence reaches a certain level, then your vigilance goes down equitably to that. I don't know if that answers kind of the question or sets the stage a little bit, but that's what frustrated me the most when I was hearing about bringing China in, because it just isn't realistic into this. We have to start with baby steps and work our way up, and that's going to take some time.
Well, I think that leads perfectly, to Rose, which I know something that you wanted to discuss, which is, I think Ron really laid it out perfectly. Is that I would say that the follow-on to New START may be the first of the sort of that interim period after the Cold War, or the follow-on to the end of the Cold War type treaty. So where are the, I guess maybe the challenges or maybe the opportunities to negotiate a treaty now versus, back in 1990 or even in the early 2000s?
I think we actually, it's a simple thing, but our negotiations are facilitated these days by the advent of electronic communications. Back when I worked on the START delegation with Kurt, actually in 1990, Kurt was kind of my godfather when I was a very young expert from the State Department working on the START negotiations in 1990. But I have to say that in those days, we were using Xerox machines and telephone calls, and we didn't have email. We didn't have the ability to send, treaty text quickly around the delegation. I remember one of my jobs was, if new treaty text was produced in a certain plenary meeting, we would have the typist type it up. I would be responsible for Xeroxing what they typed up, and then I would stick it physically in people's little mail cubby holes, and they would come and collect it. And because it's very important that everybody stays on top of the latest version of the treaty text as you're working through it. And in the New START negotiations, we had email and we had electronic means to update the files and to show what the latest version of the text is. all of these things people are familiar with because you're all working electronically these days, but simple things like that really sped up the negotiations. The ability to email on a secure email system our colleagues in Washington and talk to them about developments in the negotiation, or really hash things out, as sometimes had to be the case working with the interagency. So I just want to make everybody aware that sometimes there are simple things that ease and speed up negotiations. And I think, frankly, these days we're at something of an advantage over where we were in those earlier days. Now, it's interesting that the Russians to this day do not use email for official communications. And I don't know exactly about the Chinese and what their attitude is, but that's up to them to worry about. They'll need to figure it out from their perspective. But from the US perspective, I feel like we have a good battle rhythm in these negotiations, and that really helps to drive the momentum. As you know, if you've worked in any setting, whether a student or in a government setting or an industrial organization, the one who holds the pen tends to drive the momentum and can really shape the proceedings in ways that the other participants cannot. And that's been one of the great advantages of the United States, I think, in negotiations over time. Now, the point is correct that the Chinese usually sit and wait to hear what others have to say in a very formal, like plenary setting, and they are extremely cautious. There's no question about it. But now I've had, and we've had, over 10 years of experience working with the Chinese in this so-called P5 process. Now, I was involved in it only from 2011 when it started until I left government in 2016. But I could see over those years, the Chinese became less cautious and less, I would say, standoffish during the process, and became more ready and willing to take responsibility. The P5, if you're not aware of that terminology, these are the nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime. So that is the UK, France, the US, Russia, and China. And so we decided back at the time of the review conference for the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2010 that we should begin getting together on a regular basis to talk about the future and how to multilateralize the arms control processes going forward. So there has been some experience in that setting, working with the Chinese, and also the longstanding experience already referred to, working with them on negotiations like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself. So they're quite active in those multilateral venues. So all of this is not entirely foreign to them, but it will take a long time. And I agree with everything Josh said about the necessity to take it step by step and to work to develop their sense of having a national interest in pursuing negotiated restraint on their weapon systems. I posted in the chat that nobody's going to come to the negotiating table unless they feel, and they should not, unless they feel that a negotiated treaty or agreement will serve their national security interests. And that definitely goes for the United States of America, but that goes for all parties. They're not going to come to the table. You can't drag them to the table or threaten them to come to the table. You have to show them that their national security interests can be served through participating in an effort like a nuclear reduction negotiation. So I do feel that that's really important, and it's something that we need to bear in mind working with the Chinese. But I also wanted to make everyone aware that there is already a start that has been made. Oh, that's not a pun here. It's I'm meaning to say that we have now a good 10 years of working with the Chinese in the P5, and even before that in some other treaty regimes where they have been active and continue to be active to this day.
Kurt, I thought this might be a good time to bring in some of the questions, because we have two that are relatively in the same sphere. And then, Ron, I'm going to come to you with a different question. But it's more or less, I'm going to slightly paraphrase here because I'm going to combine two, is that given the current geopolitical environment that the US and Russia are currently enmeshed in, how realistic is it to consider, future arms control, arms reductions with them? And another, person asked, the context or the background of this is obviously with the pretty obvious Russian violation of the INF, the collapse of the INF, and then other issues that percolate around the INF issue, which is the circumvention, the RS-26 issue. So maybe you can put all those things together, talk about the challenges of I guess the current geopolitical environment, and maybe bring in some of your INF experience, because I think it would be valuable.
Thank you. Perhaps can I tell just a bit of a story in the very beginning? I went to the Joint Staff to work on INF. I was supposed to be the individual who worked with the West Germans to convince them to eliminate their P-1A missiles. And on my third day in the Joint Staff, someone left that worked on START, and they moved me to START. The admiral that I worked for at that time was Dean Sackett, and he took me to lunch. And because he saw me reading a copy of Arms Control Today at my desk, and he said, I want to tell you why we're doing this. And he said, we're going to reduce and we're going to limit weapons. And that's a good thing. But the primary purpose is different. It's to establish a relationship with another nuclear power, begin to understand what their forces are, how they operate, be able to use verification and monitoring procedures to be able to pick out those points when it looks like you have a political confrontation and they want to do something with your forces, so you know how to react and when to engage. And that wasn't the whole story, but it framed how I've thought about arms control forever. I do believe, some people would call that strategic stability. I believe there's still room for that. I believe we want to know, and the Russians want to know, that they're not threatened. And they want to understand what we do and how we do that. Over the course of a series of treaties, we've gotten much closer to data that's really effective for understanding forces. In the original START treaty, we exchanged data on Warhead Counting based on attribution rules. How do we do that? Well, we determined the throw weight for the range of Soviet missiles, and then the weight that we thought was the lightest weight for one of their warheads. And then we agreed on how many warheads we would count on each system. It wasn't how many were actually loaded, but it was a kind of a maximum load capability. The Treaty of Moscow, I'm not a huge fan of, but they did do one thing. They moved us in the direction of counting operationally deployed warheads. A problem with the treaty was he counted operationally deployed differently than the Russians did. And so if you looked at what we presented, they didn't match. We corrected that when we negotiated New START. And in New START, we don't use an attribution rule for how many warheads are associated with an ICBM or an SLBM. We use an actual count. And that actual count is confirmed every time we conduct an inspection. We exchange data on how many warheads are on each missile. And when an inspection team goes to that site, the first thing they get is a briefing on what's there. We also put another little thing in to the notification process in the New START treaty that really helps us to understand their forces. I believe helps them to understand our forces. We gave each ICBM and each SLBM and each heavy bomber something that we call the unique identifier. It's the serial number for the first stage of an ICBM or an SLBM, and it's a tail number for the aircraft. But every time there is a movement of one of those ICBMs, SLBMs, or heavy bombers, it's notified. But it's also notified with the associated unique identifier. So as you collect data over time, it becomes more difficult to cheat because you're confirming the movement of systems. You see problems in their system. If all of a sudden there's one batch of ICBMs that go to deployment and they quickly go back into the production factory for some kind of work, you know there's some sort of problem with that system. So perhaps I'm going to try and go to the warhead part. It would be really difficult to see how you could assign unique identifiers to warheads and use that as a way to track them. The visibility of the warhead, or the ability to observe the direct warhead, makes it difficult to do that. We have technology that we use right now in the new START treaty to confirm objects that are declared to be non-nuclear on the front section. We call it radiation detection equipment. You would need some sort of a technology, and actually people within the Department of Energy and the National Nuclear Security Agency are working on developing that kind of equipment to measure, but there's an opportunity to move forward. And the radiation detection equipment, I'll go back to that for just a minute. On some Russian ICBMs, there are extra objects on the front section. So when you go out there to count, you don't see 10 objects, you see 12 objects. So the first question you answer, what are the two other objects? And they actually take those objects and they remove them from the section. You get to observe that process. They set it up, and then you use radiation detection equipment to confirm that the object's not nuclear. It's a mathematical. First, you take a background reading of radiation. Then you take the square root of that number, and there's a multiplication factor in the tree, which happens to be 3. And then you take another measurement with the radiation detection equipment, and as long as it's lower than the number you've come up with, you can say it's non-nuclear. I'll do a quick mathematical thing. If your background radiation is 100, the square root of 100 is 10. If the factor is 3, you add 30 to the measurement. And when you conduct your measurement on the object, as long as it comes in as lower than 130, it's considered to be non-nuclear. You have to come up with a system that we can use that provides confidence for warheads. And it's, as Ron said, a difficult thing to do, but it's something that we need to consider and try and understand how we could do that.
Well, we have some very good questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and some from familiar names. So I'm just going to try and combine two and maybe throw it out to the panel, maybe Ron or Kurt or Rose or Josh, if you feel comfortable answering or want to answer, just, I guess, stick your finger up and or just unmute yourself. We're small enough. This comes from Bruce Godwin, which is, treaties, especially testing treaties, have moved from lowering yields to 0 yield. I think he's talking about the CTBT here. This is unverifiable, and is perhaps the reason that the CTBT has failed to be ratified. The original intent with the CTBT was a verifiable 1 KT limit. It went to 0. Within this context, the argument has been made that these very low yield activities are of little or no military value. This begs the question, if they do not matter to military affairs, why ban them to begin with? Why not leave them out of the treaty so as to improve the likelihood of ratification? This is obviously getting towards the ease of trying to get towards future more ratification or more arms control treaties in the future. Does anybody want to take that question? It's a good one. I see Kurt smiling. Rose, you unmuted. Ron, you unmuted. So maybe.
Well, ladies first.
Oh, thank you, Rod. Bruce, that question is worth an entire seminar on its own, as you know. And I do want to give a shout out for the monograph you did with Anna Pichel at Livermore on this very set of issues, reviewing the arguments that have been made with regard to this issue. How can you monitor if you cannot really be 100% certain that there is no release of radiation from some of these small experiments that are done within containers? Can you be absolutely 100% sure that there is 0 yield? There is no yield replaced, yield produced. Sorry, I said radiation, yield produced. So I actually agree with the argument that you lay out, which is that argument that you can monitor and verify explosive nuclear testing to a very significant low level. And, you know, honestly, if a little bit of yield is produced in one of these experiments, does it matter? Because the greater benefit of banning explosive nuclear testing pays off for the United States of America. And by the way, I do believe the argument that's oft made, and I agree with it, that the United States has a tremendous advantage from the large number of nuclear tests that we have already done over many, many years. And that data is now available to us to ensure that our existing warheads remain safe, secure, and effective. So it's, for me, there's a way that we should be locking in where we are today by ensuring that the moratorium on explosive nuclear testing that exists, and it's a good thing, even the North Koreans at the moment are continuing to abide by it, although we can't be sure, but having the CTBT enforced would bring some advantages, particularly with regard to on-site inspection and other measures that would help us, I think, to address some of these questions that are out there.
There are a lot of perspectives on the CTBT, but let me just go to a couple of arms control considerations. The decision to go to zero yield was rather abrupt, and it had political consequences. It may well have been what cost the test ban treaty ratification in the Senate, consent to ratification in the Senate. But it had some other consequences. When we finished up the joint verification experiment and we got unanimous ratification of the Threshold Test Ban Treaty and the Peaceful Nuclear Explosions Treaty, there was a policy commitment to a step-by-step process of continuing to engage with the Soviet Union. When that became Russia, we were able to keep some of that peer-to-peer engagement with programs such as Rose was running at NNSA, or DOE, and to have that kind of engagement, but that has dried up. And what happened to some degree was that in an effort to get a final agreement, we leaped beyond what we probably would have done if we had continued a step-by-step process. And that brings me to a second sort of arms control issue or perspective. Many of us in arms control have used the argument, I've had it in my prepared remarks when I was official, that zero is easier to verify than some number. We started this in INF to say, well, if you see an SS-20, rather than arguing over whether it's the 100th or the 99th, if it's prohibited, and it's binary decision and it's easy. The problem is, what's an SS-20? Or to put it in the actual problem that ended up derailing the INF treaty, which is the range of a Glickam, because it became analog rather than digital and binary. It actually is a definitional issue. I think we're going to have a lot more of this problem in the future. We've experiencing technological changes that are going to transform how we do arms control. Some of those may be beneficial, but a number are really going to create new challenges.
Well, we have two questions I want to get to in about 8 minutes. The first is from Ahmet Uzuncu, which again is pretty, people should know who he is. Would it be sensible to ban totally certain categories of nuclear weapons from a verification point of view? So it gets to the sort of follow on to the New START. And I do want to get to maybe the final question, depending on time, will come from Sandy Vershbow. So does anybody want to take Ahmet's question about totally banning a certain category of weapon?
We've done it on occasions, but generally it isn't very attractive to either side. usually because when they're looking at something, they have a reason for doing it. It is, the issue is hot again because of the issue of hypersonic boost glide vehicles, and to what degree are they or aren't they going to be captured by existing agreements, and should they or should they not be captured in future agreements. And the problem is that, of course, I mean, the question is, what are we talking about here? When Frank Carlucci brought me back to defense while I was the START negotiator, he wanted me to help sell the INF treaty on the Hill. And Mike Glittman and I went in to see a group of senators. And when we came out, Mike said, well, how'd I do? And I said, well, you were great, except for the part where you lied to the Senate. And he said, I never lied to the Senate. What are you talking about? And I said, well, Mike, you said you had never heard of a hypersonic boost glide vehicle. And he said, well, I hadn't. I said, sure you did. You came into my office in Geneva and you said, let's go get a pizza. And I said, can you give me 30 minutes? I got to finish writing up something on hypersonic boost glide vehicles. Well, at that time, they were PowerPoint things that we were thinking about as possibly relevant to START 1. And my approach, with the emphasis on fast flyers, was that we would count them as ICBMs. Okay, nobody was thinking of them in the INF context. INF ended up with a definition of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles that left a gap into which hypersonic boost glide vehicles would fit and therefore be excluded or be a loophole. Well, guess what? The INF definition being already agreed got put into START 1, and since it was already agreed, it's a new START. And so we have this issue of certain categories that might be excluded. Do we need to include them or not? Well, it actually could be fairly easy to include them, except now you've got another issue, which is particularly China, but also the United States, have a tremendous interest in conventional intermediate range systems. So what are the implications for that for START? These are the kind of issues that we're dealing with.
And that's exactly, Josh, let me ask Sandy's question.
Yeah,
Maybe
sorry,
you
go
can
on.
jump in on that, just because I want to make sure, because
No, it's fine.
it's really on this thing. It's like both sides are deploying systems, including medium and intermediate range missiles previously banned by the INF Treaty, plus low-yield SLBM warheads, plus nuclear SLCMs, sea-launched cruise missiles, and hypersonic air-launched cruise missiles, et cetera, et cetera. Both sides could see this as being usable to counter conventional aggression. So these capabilities could lower the nuclear threshold, i.e. increase instability in the bilateral relationship and lead to the potential for uncontrolled escalation. So what would be the best way to mitigate these risks, perhaps in a follow-on agreement to New START? Ron, it picked up there, but Josh, if you want to jump in there, and then maybe I'll come back for one last round the table before we close out.
I'll just make one comment. Going back to that, because it also does have to do with this, is the comment about verification and banning entire classes. We have to always remember the fundamental value of an arms control agreement is the normative value, what it sets as the norm. The verification is a way to set the level of confidence in the agreement of both sides. So the scope of what you can do is not determined by the verification. The verification determines what level of confidence you apply to how well you can give confidence that that's being achieved. So just the whole idea is do you build a building, or do you build a safe building, or how do you find the confidence you have that that building is going to be safe? You should never tie your hands just basically based on the verification measures, but always just remember, if your goal is normative, and if, for example, in this case, what can you really achieve? Well, you just have to sort of balance it out based upon what do you want to do militarily, but then look at the verification and then determine what can you do militarily. Sorry, Ron.
In general, I think anything is stabilizing or destabilizing in the context of, do you have a strong balance? Do you have confidence in your forces? Command and control is going to be a very important issue. There's a tendency to demonize particular systems, and I think it often distorts the debate. But let me give you an example that's current now, that's maybe somewhat fresh. And that is the Russians, perhaps as part of an influence campaign, have been teasing us with accounts of nuclear-powered air launch cruise missiles and autonomous nuclear-powered unmanned intercontinental torpedoes. And so there is, they seem bizarre systems to us. They seem redundant, given you ask, well, what is it they do that you don't already have to deal with? I think everybody's missing the whole point, which is where the technology is going. In both cases, what you're talking about are long range, long endurance, unmanned platforms that are going to revolutionize modern warfare, and wire the world. And some of it's going to be done for civilian purposes and scientific purposes. We are going to see a world in which there is going to be many more platforms, especially with the fragility of space. People are looking for alternatives. And the Russians seem to have some ideas about how they might want to do this. We may have different ideas. But I think that if you look at those, you can look at them as agitprop pieces to get our attention or negotiating leverage or whatever. But I think the longer term way to look at them is that they're reflections of prototypes to transform how a lot of operations are going to be conducted in the decades ahead.
I'm cognizant of time. We have just hit the hour mark. So Rose and Kurt, I want to give you each the last word, and preferably 1 minute each, although I'm not going to hold you to that if you go a little bit over. So whoever wants to go first, just Rose, I saw you come off mute a little early. If you want to go first, and we'll finish with Kurt, or vice versa. It's up to you two.
Okay, that's fine. I will just mention there are a lot of questions in the chat, and Sandy Birchbaugh's question also gets to, what do we do now that the INF treaty has gone away? One thing I really wanted to say in wrapping up is that no single treaty is going to address all these issues, and no single, arms control effort is going to address all of these issues. I mentioned earlier, again in the chat, that we have to pay attention to the spectrum of capabilities that serve our national security and are in our toolbox, and that includes, as Ron just mentioned, having the wit and the focus to ensure that we are also seeking to sustain some kind of balance and not letting our strategic advantage or strategic balance of forces get completely out of whack, so that our national security becomes at risk. But there are roles I see for continuing negotiated restraint. And I do think I've become increasingly convinced that we should begin to look at regional approaches to get some constraints on these intermediate range systems. The Russians have put a moratorium on the offer on the table for systems of intermediate range and ground launching in Europe. The first offer they made was not good. It was a propaganda ploy, but the offer that's now on the table is worth looking at, because they're offering wide-ranging verification and monitoring throughout European Russia. So we should look at this and consider it. And then we have to talk to the Chinese and talk to them about how they would see it in their interest, as they have some equivalents in intermediate range missiles that are ground launched with both Russia and the United States. Would they have an interest in seeking negotiated restraint in Asia on these kinds of systems? So I think we have to bear in mind that there's going to be no silver bullet arms control treaty, but we can still work these problems piece by piece, always bearing in mind that other aspects, other tools will have to be brought to bear also to sustain our national security.
Very good points. Kurt, the final word is yours.
I completely agree with Rose about it could be multiple treaties to try and address the issues. I've always thought, as we begin to think about a new treaty, one of the most important things to do is to have a very good understanding of what our research and development programs are and what the other treaty partners' research and development programs are. And we tend, both from the developmental standpoint and from the intelligence standpoint, put those things in very special compartments. But the lead negotiators and clearly the NSC staff need to have a clear understanding of what's out there that we may face in the future and what we need to protect that we're working to develop.
Very well said. With that, I wanted to thank all of you, and particularly I wanted to thank Josh. Again, this was his idea to conceive, and we were able to together pull it off. And I thank all of you, Ron, Rose, Kurt, and Josh, and as well as my colleagues on the call, for giving us an hour, even a little bit more. And we did have so many questions that we didn't get to them all, but I did my best to try and condense them as best as I could. The final word here is that if you liked what you saw, please check us out on our website, which is fpri.org, where we have daily analysis put up, multitudes of reports published. And if you are so inclined, you can choose to support the organization because we are a nonprofit and that's what we do. And we sustain ourselves on support from the public at large. And that's all of you tuning in. So with that, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you all for your time and have a good rest of the day and stay warm, especially to those people in Texas.